Well, welcome back, class, to MUS 222, the History and Sociology of Rock Music. Today we're going to be in Module 11, and we're going to be looking at the 1970s art rock, reggae, and punk. And you may think it's a little crazy that we have those three genres all together, but they do actually kind of overlap one another. So before we get started, make sure you have your notes out and you are ready to go. So let's learn a little bit more about these genres. So in the late 1960s, art rock, or otherwise known as progressive rock, fragmented off from the mainstream music. This term was for a diverse and eclectic mix of rock styles that were really bound together more by a common philosophy than by an actual musical style. They started to incorporate elements of other forms of what they called high culture music with rock. These were European classical music, American jazz, and avant-garde styles. The first styles appeared in England, where there was a very distinct separation of a highbrow versus lowbrow art, and their audiences were much more pronounced. Now, a group called Procol Harum, that was a London-based group, released a song called Wider Shade of Pale, and it had a prominent feature of an organ solo from the Baroque composer Bach, playing air on a G string. So take a second, pause while you're writing your notes, listen to just a minute or so of this, and then come on back. I've got another example for you too. Now my other example is Moody Blues, which is from Birmingham, England, and they released an album that utilized a symphony orchestra as well as the mellotron. And now the mellotron is an early synthesizer that's capable of reproducing the sounds of violins, cellos, and flutes. And so I would take a second, pause here, listen to a little bit of Nights in White Satin, and see if you can hear that mellotron sound. One of the most well-respected art rock bands among musicians is Yes, which has become legendary for its superior musicianship, high three-part vocal harmonies, and then these very intricate and complex compositions. All the musicians were classically trained, and they would perform complex music with unique rhythms and chord progressions. And the example that we have for you to listen to from them is Roundabout. So please be sure you listen to a good portion of Roundabout, because the beginning is going to start out a little differently, and then it will get into the more rock type of music. Perhaps more so than really any other band at this time, Pink Floyd is going to be the embodiment of art rock of the 1970s. They had electronic special effects in their recordings. Their music and lyrics took on a grand scale normally associated with classical music opera, and their concert performances became spectacles of lasers, lights, and props. And it was Pink Floyd that produced the single most significant albums of the art rock movement, the first of which is going to be The Dark Side of the Moon, with stereo effects, tape sounds, spoken voices. You had synthesizers, and they had these dreamy, conceptual, pop-oriented type songs. The other one is going to be The Wall, which is an epic rock opera, and it is very autobiographical. It can examine the emotional wall that was built up around the group. The lead guitarist, Syd Barrett, was the group's mastermind of experimenting, and he had to actually leave the band in the mid-60s due to signs of mental instability from the use of LSD, and so that leadership shifted to bassist Roger Waters. Now, we will take some time during class to look at one of their songs, but while you're here, hit pause and listen to a little bit of The Dark Side of the Moon. Frank Zappa was one of rock's most controversial musicians and most brilliant. He's known for his use of non-musical elements and having this avant-garde kind of experimentation. He was a musical anarchist who tore down convention and accepted norms in creating some of rock's most sophisticated and intellectual music. Zappa's lyrical themes were often very dark, but he effectively would use humor, satire, and vulgarity. In some cases, his lyrics were just downright gross. He was an admirer of the 20th century avant-garde composers and surrealist artists like Salvador Dali. He also enjoyed comics like Lenny Bruce and Mort Sahl, and the musical comedian Spike Jones. With a love and respect for R&B and jazz, he brought all of these influences into his very highly original music. And so we can take a look at this by pausing and listen to a little bit of Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, which is not only a good song, but it's good advice for you as well. Other English bands of the era that helped define rock art are going to include Jethro Tull, that's led by vocalist and flautist Ian Anderson. And then you had the innovative organ trio Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. And then finally, we have Genesis, Peter Gabriel, and the Electric Light Orchestra. So another type of experimental rock is going to be known as glitter rock, and this is where artists had an androgynous type of dress. And basically what that means is that they had characteristics of both male and female. And they were very anti-conformist. One of the most influential glitter rock performers is going to be David Bowie, who portrayed himself as an extraterrestrial with the hit single Space Oddity. In 1972, he announced he was gay in an interview and began to develop his alter ego, the androgynous bisexual alien rock star Ziggy Stardust. Now, we also had Queen, that featured a very charismatic lead singer, Freddie Mercury. They were known for their harmonized vocals and changing tempos. And of course, how many of us don't know the song Bohemian Rhapsody? So, and if you don't, then you definitely need to make sure you listen to this. So take a second here, pause. I want you to listen to a little bit of David Bowie and then also listen to some Queen. Reggae's roots go back to the folk music of Jamaica known as mento. And by the late 1950s, Jamaican youth began copying R&B they were hearing on the radio and developed their own variation of music known as ska. Ska is an up-tempo music that combines R&B influenced walking bass with accents on the offbeat, so on beats 2 and 4 from mento. And so we have an example here, Concrete Jungle by the Specials. If you want to take a second and pause and listen to a little bit of this, you can kind of get the idea of what ska music was. Now, in the summer of 1966, temperatures soared on the island, making ska too fast to play or dance to and slower. Updated version emerged known as Rock Steady. Now Rock Steady is going to be more relaxed and looser rhythmically than its predecessor, and Rock Steady simplified the bass and drum syncopations of ska, but it still retained the offbeat accents. Reggae is Jamaican music that evolved from the combination of folk music, American R&B, and then you had traditional Afro-Caribbean music. By the late 1960s, reggae recordings were starting to filter out of Jamaica, and they started to make a presence in the U.S. The primary rhythmic feature of reggae is the rhythm, and or this is the intertwined patterns that are played by the bass, guitar, and drums. Each instrument in the band has a clearly defined role to play. While the guitar provides choppy upstroke strumming on beats 2 and 4, the bass and drums are locked into this very syncopated beat that often de-emphasizes the downbeat of each measure. Most reggae is played slowly, allowing polyrhythms and lyrics to be clearly heard. Its lyrics are often concerned with political protest, social injustice, racism, and, of course, the Rastafarian movement. Now, one of the most important things about reggae is that it's closely connected to the Rastafarian movement. And now this is a movement whose followers believe that they will be transferred to their African homeland and escape Babylon, which Babylon is just basically a metaphor for their oppression in the New World. It was inspired by the writings of Marcus Garvey. Rastafarians reinterpreted the Bible to suit their own needs, and in time they developed their own cultural values that included songs of social and political protest. And then, of course, another big one was the smoking of Ghana or marijuana as a sacramental herb, and then the other is wearing dreadlocks. So in the mid-60s, the Rastafarian culture began to intermingle with the popular music of Jamaica to provide the basis for reggae. Now, I know there is a lot to read on this slide, so while you are taking all of your notes, take a second and pause and hit the link for I Shot the Sheriff. Listen to a little reggae music and finish your notes out. Bob Marley had not only become the most famous reggae musician, but he actually became a national hero. Marley used his fame to expound upon his political viewpoints, which included social activism, rebellion against the system, and his belief in Rastafarianism, which led to an assassination attempt in December of 1976. This left him wounded, and he actually was forced into exile. Of course, we are all probably very familiar with Bob Marley. We hear his music, or we think of him when we think of reggae music. You've listened to I Shot the Sheriff, so feel free to pause here and listen to Get Up, Stand Up. And do notice the Get Up, Stand Up is definitely a protest song. So as you're listening to it, listen for those protest words. So punk emerged in the mid-1970s as a backlash reaction against nearly everything that rock had brought to the decade. The conservative and self-indulgent tendencies of folk rock, the pretentiousness of art rock and heavy metal, and then the manipulation of the marketplace by the rock establishment. So punk brought rock back to the streets. Punk was more than just a musical trend. It was a culture. It was defined by its rejection of any and all control. While you're writing your notes, pause and hit the link to listen to this punk song here. Now, the 1960s through the 70s brought a growing number of garage bands to suburban American landscape. Every now and then, a garage band single would become a hit, like Louie Louie by the Seattle Kingsmen. And you probably are familiar with Louie Louie. I know that it's a pep band favorite, so if you were in band, you probably have played it or heard it somewhere. The prevailing attitude that was that anybody could buy a guitar and an amp, and they would learn 3 chords and they could start a band. This is also the fundamentals to the principles of punk. The MC5 or Motor City 5 was formed in 1965 in Detroit. This was a tough industrial city where harsh economic conditions offered very little hope. Their political rantings and sloganeering at concerts earned them a large and devout local following. And so their first album, Kick Out the Jams, was refused airplay due to the angry, obscene lyrics and the very loud, rebellious sounds. So take a second and pause and listen to a little bit of MC5. Do note that there may, if you have small children around, it may not be appropriate. So the Stooges were formed in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it was led by lead singer Iggy Pop. Now, Iggy Pop was a rough and tough youth who had been raised in a trailer park, and he is known as the godfather of punk. The Stooges concerts were an onslaught of noise and anarchy, and so Iggy would often do crazy things like rub raw meat on himself, he would fling himself into the crowd, and he would even cut himself with broken bottles. We're going to watch a little bit of a video, and we'll see some more about Iggy Pop, and you're going to see him get peanut butter and rub it all over himself, and just an odd, crazy thing that he would do on stage. We have a song here, The Passenger, so take a second and hit pause and listen to a little bit of The Passenger to hear the Stooges and lead singer Iggy Pop. Now, the Velvet Underground was the first important New York band to adopt the lyric themes of despair, drug addiction, and violence associated with punk music. The group was formed in 1965 by Lou Reed, who did the vocals and guitar, and then you also had John Cale, who did vocals and electronic violin. Now, they were two classically trained musicians who were involved in the New York's avant-garde scene. And then artist Andy Warhol became their manager, and you might recognize Andy Warhol's name. He's kind of known for the Campbell Soup painting. With their crude sound, lyrics featuring harsh themes of drug addiction, sadomasochism, alienation, desperation, and darkness, and their association with New York arts community, the Velvet Underground was the most influential of the pre-punk band era. And so we have a song here for you to pause and listen to a little bit of Heroin by the Velvet Underground. So like the Velvet Underground, the New York Dolls gained notoriety playing at the Mercer Arts Center in New York and became the first true American punk group. The Dolls would combine a glam look. They would wear lipstick, eye makeup, and stacked heels with this amateurish approach to performing, and they would sing about bad girls, drugs, and New York street life. And so our example here is Personality Crisis. Take a second and pause and listen to this song here. A grimy little bar at 315 Bowery in New York's Lower East Side called CBGB started to book underground rock bands and within months became the center of the New York punk scene. And we'll see a little bit more in a video during class time, but what I want you to do is check out these pictures and just notice that it was very small in space. It had lots of stickers, obviously, you see all over the walls, but it was kind of grimy and dirty place. But this is where all of that punk went down. One of the first groups to play at CBGB was Television, and this was a band that was influenced by avant-garde saxophonist John Coltrane and Albert Ayler, the Rolling Stones, and a French impressionistic composer, Maurice Ravel. They had bassist Richard Hell, and he was the first to wear the ripped clothes and the just fell out of bed kind of hairstyle. And of course, our example here is going to be Blank Generation. So please take a second and pause and listen to Blank Generation so you can kind of understand what the punk sound was like as well as what the Television sounded like. Another early CBGB artist is going to be Patti Smith. She's a painter, a poet, and rock journalist who began experimenting in 1971 with her poems to the musical accompaniment. Her punk fashion statement was just a white button-down shirt with a man's tie. And something interesting about her, she doesn't really sing. She's more like just saying poetry over music. So she's quite fascinating to listen to. It's something different for sure. Take a second and listen to one of her best known songs, Piss Factory, and then we'll move on. So we have a group of high school buddies from Queens, New York, that formed called the Ramones, who played rock and roll that was simple, fast, raw, energetic, and fun. Their music was intense and unrelenting while their shows rarely lasted over 20 minutes. With a uniform of torn jeans and leather jackets, they have been called the most powerful in rock history. In summer of 1976, the Ramones toured England and they created a sensation in the rock underground that helped ignite the British punk movement. So take a second and listen to the second song, I Want to Be Sedated, as you already listened to the first one earlier. While New York punk was linked to the city's art scene, the British punk movement was driven primarily by the country's poor economy. Punk emerged as a legitimate social protest. In the 1970s, pub rock evolved into punk and would be so offensive and so disruptive that the major labels could no longer afford to ignore them. The Sex Pistols were either the perfect antidote for everything that was wrong with rock or a very clever act of fraud played on the record industry, the media, and the establishment. So the band was this very crude, amateurish, depraved, and extremely offensive band. They managed to outrage the British press. They offended the royal family. They actually confounded the radio and record industries, and they started to take punk beyond the limits. An out-of-work janitor whose teeth were green from neglect and who had such a nasty attitude that others began calling him Johnny Rotten was the lead singer. Now, a friend of Rotten's replaced a member who quit, and his name was Sid Vicious. And he was the bassist. They wanted to repulse the establishment and provoke authorities as they did in their second single, With God Save the Queen. Now, it was a malicious attack on the monarchy, coinciding with the Queen's Silver Jubilee, that was immediately banned from radio and was pulled from the stores. So I want you to take a second and listen to God Save the Queen. So I have a slide that has all of the lyrics on it. So when I click over there, pause there, and then listen to God Save the Queen while you look at the lyrics. And I want you to think about what part of the song lyrics from God Save the Queen were so controversial. The Clash were also one of the most political of the English punk bands and incorporated a broad base of musical styles into the recordings. They took on causes like youth unemployment, racism, and police brutality. Their punk sound had added this reggae beat to it. And we have an example, Rock the Casbah. We also have The Damned, which played fast, angry music while taunting their audience by spitting on them and provoking them. And of course, we have an example here with New Rose. So take a second, pause, and listen to both of these examples. After the initial wave of punk bands redefined rock and shook up the record industry, we had a second or a new wave of artists that appeared and took elements of punk and they would fuse them with more pop-oriented sensibilities. New wave bands began to incorporate other stylistic strains into their music, including American R&B, reggae, and even synthesizer-based techno-pop. The earliest examples of these are going to be Blondie and the Talking Heads. The Cars emerged as a major commercial success with the 1950s influence. You had Devo, who combined a futuristic robotic image with this techno pop and then the monotone vocals. And of course, I've got a couple of examples for you, Jocko Homo, and then Whip It is probably a song that you would know already. It's a very, very well-known standard. And then another band that relied heavily on image and monotone and chatty vocals is going to be the B-52s with their biggest hit in 1990 called Love Shack. So take a second and pause here and listen to these examples I have for you, especially if you are not familiar with one of these songs. The English New Wave movement was stronger than its American counterparts as it featured a very simplistic sound of the 1950s rock like Buddy Holly. It had the fast driving rhythms like punk rock, but clean and clear guitars. And then you had groups like the Pretenders, the Police, and Elvis Costello that make up that new wave sound. All right, so while you're finishing out your notes, listen to a little bit of Radio Radio by Elvis Costello. All right, so I want to take just a second and kind of do a compare and contrast between American New Wave music versus punk music. So American New Wave music is going to be your very mainstream that people are going to want to listen to it. They seek it out, they hear it on the radio, where punk music was a lot more violent and anti-establishment, and so it tended to not be played on the radio quite as often. American New Wave had keyboards, they would have saxophones and other instruments in it, where the punk music was basically your typical rock band, electric guitars, drum, and bass. American New Wave music was very clear sounding. You could hear hear all the instruments and hear the voices very clearly, where punk music is going to have that distorted sound to it. And then American New Wave music was very fast with repeating notes on the bass. Now punk music would be more of this throbbing pulse, and it had a lot of anger inside of it. Now they both shared the monotone vocals with their singing, which means that didn't necessarily have a lot of change in the voice when they sing. It's more robot-like. And so that was probably the one thing they had in common. But as you can see, I would, if I didn't teach this class and I didn't know much about music, I would never compare these two and say that one came off the other because they have such different sounds. Alongside the new wave movement came a darker and angrier and even louder evolution of punk known as hardcore, which spoke out about U.S. government involvement in politics in Asia, South America, and South Africa. Hardcore punks developed their own fashion of tattoos, they had buzz cut haircuts, and army boots, and even their own dancing, which we call slam dancing. And this was accompanied by something called moshing. This is where participants would form pits in front of the stage and they basically just smash into each other. Hardcore concerts often erupted in just chaos and violence. Take a second and listen to Rise Above by Black Flag. One of the most important hardcore bands was Black Flag. With a very fast beat, they would have distorted guitars, that monotone vocals, and then songs about meaninglessness and anger against the establishment. Clubs actually would ban them for the violence that occurred during their concerts. Hardcore lyrics were sometimes sarcastic and humorous about very serious issues. And the example I'm going to have for you here by the Dead Kennedys is Kill the Poor. So I do have the lyrics on the next slide, so I will click over here in just a second. But I want you to read the lyrics and listen to the song. Basically what they're saying is meant in a satire type of way. It's not serious, it's being sarcastic. And so see as you listen to the song and you read the lyrics if you can catch that tone from it. So what I want you to do is, after you've listened to this, is think about what is the message in this song. What is this song about? Now, usually I would let you answer in class if we were in a live class, but since we're not, I'm going to talk about it. So this song is really a sarcastic rip on how the upper class views the working poor. And they view them as basically just a problem or a blemish on their society. And so why bother keeping them around? Let's just kill them all. So that's kind of the idea with this, with the meaning to this song. But yes, so a lot of these punk songs we may not be able to, because it's so hard to hear them or it's hard to understand them. You do basically need the lyrics written out so you can hear what they're trying to say and know that there is a lot of times a political leaning to their lyrics. So other hardcore bands include The Germs. You have X that actually took a lot of rockabilly influences and added it to punk music. And then Catholic Discipline. So those are some other hardcore punk bands if you're interested in looking those up. And we're going to end our lecture here. So make sure all your notes are covered, and please make sure that you're listening to all of the examples.